Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together, we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the show Jane Milburn, a great friend of mine. Jane presents a compelling case for why we need to change the way we dress. She's the founder and creative force behind Textile Beat. She champions slow clothing. She's written a book about this topic too. She loves natural fibres and upcycling. So slow clothing is all really about finding meaning in what we wear. And she says slow clothing is a creative, ethical and meaningful way of dressing that engages our head, heart and hands. Jane talks about ways of protecting and regenerating the planet through this lens of slow clothing. It's more than just wearing natural clothes. She has a whole slow clothing philosophy and a slow clothing manifesto. And she talks about how secondhand is the new organic and mending is good for the soul. So Jane offers us a beautiful, everyday, practical philosophy, accessible to everyone everywhere, that brings us to wholeness through living more simply, creatively and fairly. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation today with Jane Milburn. Well, thank you for joining me today on the show, Jane. It's just such a pleasure. And I thought, like, you've been a Churchill Scholar this year, which has been a bit disrupted. And I thought we could talk about that in a minute, because that's an amazing thing that you've been doing. But I wanted to just begin with this journey of how does one move from being an agricultural scientist to a slow clothing champion and sustainability consultant? What happened there, and what is slow clothing, and what drew you into that whole world?
Well, it's probably easiest just to start at the beginning. I grew up on a sheep farm in New Zealand, and that's where I came to love wool, natural fibres, and we came to Australia. I did my secondary school and university here and studied agricultural science. We'd had a dairy farm in between as well, and so that led me to study agriculture. But I realised I wasn't actually a scientist per se, and so I did rural journalism. That's, the communication. So my first job was with the ABC as a rural reporter, and I was in Victoria, and that's sheep country as well. So all through my journey, I've had these natural fibres, and then I came to Queensland, got married, had 3 children, and did rural communications jobs, worked with newspapers, the Courier Mail, Country Life, and then for farm groups, I did advocacy work for farm groups. And that was probably where and that's communicating a message around what's important to them. One of the main ones I did was Save the Aussie Banana for the Australian Banana Growers Council. And that was all about a pest and disease, a rejection of imports on the basis of pests and diseases. So, over time, when our third child finished school, it was just a little bit of transition. I had done a leadership program, the Australian Rural Leadership Program, and that really helped me understand what my values were, what was important to me. And we're taught to step up and lead wherever we see it's necessary. So when Lily, the third child, had finished school, it was kind of like, right, it's a little bit more my time again now. I don't need to be doing things I don't want to be doing. And so it was really then a search around meaning and purpose for the next phase. And it coincided when I was doing the second part of my leadership training. The Rana Plaza factory collapsed in 2013 in Bangladesh. And we really had this window into where all the cheap clothes that we'd just sort of been, enjoying this arrival of these gifts and not having to worry about clothing, because also through my career, I guess I've been following the food story and how we became aware of where our food came from and wanting to grow more and wanting to have local. So I realised, this combination of things that, the clothing story was missing in there, that we'd just taken this for granted, this flow of clothing, and then we realised that that's why it's so affordable and we don't have to worry about it because it's basically being made by people in other countries, in unsafe workplaces. So that piqued my awareness. I was already on the natural fibre journey and I'd set up Textile Beat, but that really cemented the fact that there's a message here. And the other thing that I had been observing is the change in the fibres. And that was, whilst I'm concerned about the ethics, it was really the natural fibres that I was honing back in on. And I started doing some research around, you'd see that most of the clothes were synthetic. And then it was only when I found some information that I cobbled together from the FAO and from World Fibre Reports that you could see that within a decade we'd gone from having half natural fibres, half synthetic in our clothing to basically 2/3 synthetic. And synthetic fibres are actually plastic fibres. They are derived from fossil fuels and they're very affordable and easy to make, much easier than growing a crop and going through all these processes. So, but the problem with the synthetic fibres that Dr. Mark Brown's research identified was that they shed microplastic. They're plastic, they're shedding microplastic particles. And every time you wash a synthetic garment, it can shed up to 2,000 microplastic particles. So it's one of the biggest pollutants in our ocean is our synthetic clothes.
I just heard the other day that, it's not just in the sort of the surface areas and near the coast. They've found them 3 kilometres deep.
Wow.
And thick layers of this embedded that just settles down.
Yes, yes. And you see, often there's a criticism of natural fibres that, well, yes, they shed as well. They do shed, but they're shedding biodegradable material. But, it may settle into layers, it may not. If it's just out there, it just goes back into nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and is useful. It returns, whereas the plastic is there forever. And so this was something that really wasn't common. It's kind of common knowledge now, but back then it wasn't common knowledge. And so this has been the journey of my work to talk about these things and also the huge waste of clothing. As it became more affordable, there's 2 factors, the change in the fibres to the synthetics and then the modern day slavery. Those things increase the consumption 2 to 4 times in places like Australia. And we are the second largest consumer of clothing after North America. And then that leads to waste and pollution as we just sort of throw things away because they're not worth, we think they're not worth mending, if they're cheap and nasty, we've had enough of them. And the other thing is there's a loss of skills and knowledge. So we've forgotten how to mend. We've forgotten how to value our clothes. We're not buying quality pieces that might last a long time, investment pieces. So I think we have had a huge shift in the last 5 years where we've suddenly woken up to what's going on with our clothes. And, I guess that's sort of, I feel I've written a book in the meantime. Slow Clothing was sort of a consolidation of the work that I've done. And it's really just a simple narrative about our clothes. It's not about fashion in any sense, because the problem I feel with talking about fashion is by definition that's ever changing. It's what's in fashion and what's out of fashion, and therefore we throw things away. So I talk about slow clothing, but slow fashion has also become a thing over this time where we're becoming aware that natural fibres are much more comfortable to wear. And when you have natural fibre clothes, you're not having to wash them as much as the synthetics. And, when you think about the fact that means, the shedding as well as the use of resources in the simple act of washing your clothes. So natural fibres, you don't need to wash as much and they don't smell. And, there's just so many things to recommend them. But, of course, there is a downside as well. We hear a lot about the water used in cotton production. And, yes, it does use water, but if you try and grow tomatoes, as I was during the COVID lockdown, you realise how much that water takes water. So everything uses water. And the main thing we can do is, particularly with cotton garments, is wear them until they wear out. And then, we just have to accept that. Wool garments in the winter, you can almost wear a woolen jumper all winter without washing it, unless it smells or looks dirty. Hello, it doesn't need washing. That's the view I've arrived at anyway.
I think this is brilliant because we got to the point where, you wear it once, you wash it, wear it once and wash it. And I remember at home when growing up, my mum would spot clean all the time. Yeah. And she was very conscious about that. And then if she couldn't spot clean, she would actually hand wash most of her stuff. And I asked her, I said, "You've got a washing machine. What are you doing?" And she would say, "Well, my clothes will last much longer." And I still see her wearing today some of the clothes that I saw when I was growing up. And I had some of her woolen garments that she had when she was half my age, and now my daughter's wearing them. There's something even about the quality of the material is so different now even.
Yes, that's right. And so treasuring those things and valuing them is something we are returning to. Whereas for a while we went through this trend, and all the marketing, wear this is the latest colour, the latest hemline. But, really we're better having one quality thing than 5 cheaper things. And that's part of my Slow Clothing manifesto. As part of this process, I came up, personally, I do a lot of spot cleaning as well. And just while we're on that, the other thing I do is sometimes I find, you know how the inside of the collars are the parts that get dirty, and perhaps under the arms, you know, where it's a bit closer to your body, although I've started wearing much looser clothes, which is another strategy. If they're not clinging and carrying on, you know, you don't have to wash them as much either, and just air them or hang them in the shower when you're washing. That freshens them up. So all those sort of strategies are great. But in the 2014 year, I did a whole year of upcycling where I was reusing and sewing. And that was a deliberate thing. I remember going on ABC radio at the end of 2013 and saying I was going to do a whole year of, you know, using what I had, thrifting perhaps, but not too much of that, and sewing. And, you know, it felt a bit sort of as if I was putting myself out on a plank there. But I think, you know, you need to speak your own truth. And that's really what I was doing all my life. You know, I've sort of accelerated perhaps a little more conscious now in terms of almost everything I wear. I've got my own energy in, and that I've made it or upcycled it. But I realised that a lot of people, you know, not everybody wants to do that. So that's where I came up with the Slow Clothing Manifesto of actions and choices that we have. And, you know, the first one is thinking more. And then the second, this is just the order I've put them in, is natural fibres, treasuring natural fibres, and quality. That's what you mentioned before. You know, quality is really important to think about that. And sometimes we feel, oh, to hand over that amount of money for one thing. But, you know, when you buy quality, it lasts forever, you know, almost lasts forever. And then local, supporting local where we can, because a lot of things, you know, and the textile supply chain is quite complex. There's lots of different stages, and sometimes things, you know, the fibre or the clothing can travel around the world, you know, in its, you know, to get to you. It can go offshore, back again, sometimes even offshore again, you know, like a couple of different countries on the way. So supporting local makers where we can is a useful thing as well. And just having a few clothes, like having less of better quality is a good thing. But I'm not very good at being a minimalist. I like to have variety, so I get a fail on that one. But
I think that's where I do quite well. I just have a couple of basic tops. Like everyone always sees me wearing black, like, because I do a lot of gardening and I have little kids. Like I always got stuff all over me, so I figured, all right, I'll just stay straight black on the top, and then I make all my skirts. And I just have 3 or 4 wrap skirts, and they just go over anything. And I've been into Westminster Palace. I've been everywhere in the same clothes. I just kind of like, you know, throw a scarf around or something, and that dresses it up, or I just hook it up and I'm out in the garden or on my bike. It's the same thing. I have 3 or 4 skirts, 3 or 4 tops. That's it. And it's,
so you're doing slow clothing, or, you know, you are doing all this. You are living all this just by being who you are, really. And I think the permaculture life really reflects that, because you want simple, easy, comfortable, easy care, flexible, all those things. So, and the rest of the 10 actions are caring for things, baking where you can. And I know you've bought fabric and, you know, had it made, or, you know, like your skirts or the lovely African fabrics and things. And so revive, which is vintage and thrifting and using grandma's clothes, and adapting, which is where you might get the scissors out, you know, sometimes cutting off a sleeve, the bottom of the sleeve, you know, if it's too tight or it's got shabby at the end, just chop it off, and you can just hand stitch it up. And sometimes also the length of a dress or a skirt can really make a difference where it's sitting on your body. So that's adapting things to work for yourself. And you can also use natural, you know, dyeing techniques as well, things like that. It's a great way to adapt. And then the last one is salvaging, where we use what we can. And, you know, I do a lot of T-shirt yarn and things like that, where you're sort of doing your own downcycling and turning it into something else.
So tell us a bit, can you tell us a bit? So there's upcycling and downcycling. So can you just define and describe those a bit for us?
Upcycling is where you are sort of adding value either, from a sustainable perspective or creative. You want to make it look different. So you're getting a resource that's to hand, and it can go two ways. It can go off to landfill or, be used as a rag and chucked, once and chucked out, or it can be upcycled. For example, what I'm wearing today, which you probably can't really see, but I can send you a photo, but this is a table. I've made this dress out of a tablecloth, and so we don't use these tablecloths anymore, beautiful embroidered ones. So I've just turned this into a loose dress just by making, it's a little bit complicated. It's a technique called subtraction cutting, where I've cut out a hole for a neck and sleeves, and I originally turned the tablecloth into folded, into a rectangular shape, which is a pillowcase. If you imagine a big pillowcase, and then you cut a neck and sleeves, and this is the leftover bit from the rectangle. I didn't want it to be too wide, if you know what I mean. So I cut a piece off the side, and I've just used this as a bit of a scarf around my neck and just to cover my shoulders and my arms. So, I mean, it's hard to talk about that, but I've used a tablecloth that was sitting in the cupboard, not doing anything. I wouldn't wear it, you wouldn't use it for food because, when things get spilt on it, it wrecks it, So I've turned it into a garment, and that's what upcycling is, where you change something for the better in your mind, and, you keep wearing it. Whereas the downcycling is just, it's what happens with aluminium cans, they're squashed and they go off again. And we are doing a bit of, there's talk of recycling textiles. There's a group called Blocktex in Australia who are looking to extract the fibres and have them respun again down the track. But that industrial upcycling, or downcycling and then upcycling, it's a bit of a way away. So, yeah, it's just thinking
maybe
about
downcycling is my composting of my clothes.
Like,
Finished with my clothes. Like, this one is almost finished. It's got so many holes. I don't know if you can see it. So many holes in it, and it's got. I think most people don't notice the holes because there's patterns. Well, that's a bit holy.
you can slice that off and turn it
I can slice it, and I can stitch it, I can put a liner in. I do all these sorts of things. But then when they're finally ripped and had it, then I pop them into the compost or the worm farm. Yeah. And because they're natural fibres,
and then they grow again. And that's the wonderful thing about having natural fibres. You can actually confidently do that, even if it takes a little while. But I've done a couple of experiments with the different fibres. In my backyard, I had little swatches buried for 11 months, and the natural fibres almost completely disappeared in that time, except for the silk. And the synthetics were very visible, like not much change at all there. They just looked like they'd had a bit of a hard time for a while. But if I'd washed them, which I didn't do, but they would live on, which there's a benefit to that. And I have learnt that with swimwear, that synthetics are the go. I was wearing wool for a while, and I loved wearing wool onesies and just a singlet and little boy leg pants. And I loved swimming in it, but it didn't have the longevity. I only got a few months worth of swimming out of it. So I've had to return to synthetics there. So they do have some benefit, but we just don't need it all to be that.
No. And I think that's where your ethic within your manifesto of care comes in. So, if you have your synthetic bathers, then you make sure that you wash them out and you care for them so that they last as long as possible, instead of just leaving them chlorine in them or whatever. And
yes. Anyway, it's a bit of an adventure, but I think just focusing on our clothes. The other thing is you have to invest a bit of time, and a lot of people don't necessarily want to invest time or have time. There's certainly busy phases in your life, and you're probably in it in a way, Morag. You've got young children, but I definitely find that I've got more time available now because I can focus on these things. So I think there's ages and stages. But
and where did you learn how to sew? I think sometimes also it's the not quite knowing where to start, we're not having the skills. I'm so thankful. My mum always sewed. She always made clothes. And I grew up watching her make clothes. And if something happened, she'd say, "Oh, give it to me." And she'd mend it. And that still goes on. Whenever I go down, she's got anything to mend. So when what I was going to say, when I was 16, my birthday present was a sewing machine and a set of lessons with the seamstress down the road. So she taught me how to make patterns and how to read patterns and how to do, collars and buttons and things that my mum wasn't as confident about. She just does simple clothing, which is brilliant, and actually what I mostly do. But I thought that was looking back on it now, it was the most brilliant gift. And it reminds me of this quote that I read in your book, was give someone a shirt and they're clothed for a day. Teach someone to sew and they're clothed for a lifetime. It's kind of like that, give someone a fish, that sort of quote, isn't it? And it's beautiful because I felt so liberated by that. As I was growing up and really wanted to be fashionable when I was in my late teens, I could make whatever I wanted to. I could scan in secondhand shops, pick up stuff, redesign it how I wanted to, make whatever I wanted to. I'd look up and down the high street of down in Chapel Street in Melbourne and look to see what all the designers were doing. I'd go home and whip it up myself, and I felt so capable that I didn't have to spend an enormous amount of money, but I could still feel good that I could make my own stuff. And now I'm far more pragmatic, but it was a great skill to have all throughout my life, I think.
Yes, and look, that is wonderful, and I really understand because that's for me as well. My mother was actually a home economics teacher.
Oh, okay.
But she didn't, I grew up seeing her sew, and Grandma and Nana lived on the farm with us. But I really feel as if I'm a bit self-taught. You can get the basics, and sometimes you underestimate how much you know. But I could say that you teach yourself. Yeah. You teach yourself by doing, and not trying to be overly ambitious. Just start with simple things, and then you can work up, and you learn how textiles behave, how the different textiles behave and things. So
just play, you're saying.
It is play. It is, Upcycling.
And actually in your book was what I really love about your book too is that I've got it here. It's the same with your poster there. That you actually show a whole lot of techniques of different ways of sewing, which is so brilliant and so handy.
Hand stitching you can do a lot with, and I think that is definitely a place to start. If people don't have any skills, just get a needle and thread. I don't just use ordinary cotton. Usually I use crochet cotton and threads that are slightly bigger. And you can do some lovely decorative work. And I mentioned before about cutting off a sleeve, and you can just iron it, turn it up twice, and then just do a couple of rows of hand stitching. And use that hand washing technique, instead of putting it through the machine. Or if you do feel you want to put it in the machine, at least put it in a laundry bag so it doesn't get tossed around too much. But that's the place to start, is hand stitching or very simple sewing. And you only need a simple sewing machine. Yes, you can have the fancy overlocker and all that, but really you only need a simple sewing machine. And there's some great simple patterns now. And Peppermint Magazine, for example, has a whole lot of free patterns on their website, and they're relatively simple ones for people for starting out. And you can use, if you're really a beginner, then maybe going to the op shop and getting some sheets is a great place to start, because there's a lot of top sheets lying around, and you can get something that you vaguely like, but have a play and a practice with that. And the investment of time in the learning is actually, it pays off. As you say, you've got the skills, and we're a slightly older generation too, Morag. I think that makes a difference, and it makes me a little sad, this whole fast fashion, the availability of clothing. People don't, or younger people, they just don't appreciate the time, effort, and the resources and the skill that go into it. And so sometimes when they try to do something, they don't sort of realise that, you can't just magic it up in half an hour.
Mm.
Some things you can, like the wraparound skirts, and that's pretty easy.
Yeah, that's pretty easy, straightforward. So, but I think one of the things sometimes it can be overwhelming. It's a little bit, like permaculture. When you're starting out, you think, I just want to have someone to show me what, I want to see it in action. I want to see how people are doing it. What are you doing in your garden? And come and have a look at a community garden. But with sewing also, and it's kind of a very old tradition, really, isn't it? That you get people together in, I don't know about COVID, but you have sewing circles where people come together. Do you want to tell us a bit about how that works and how that's been?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, it is coming back, and there's something really quite lovely about working with other women and talking about and problem solving. I think the boomerang bag groups that are springing up are a great place to see, and there's always jobs for people who can't sew, and that is a place, not that they necessarily teach you sewing, but you certainly see the techniques and can teach yourself there. The machines are often there to use. There's also quite a lot of maker spaces emerging as well. And, like I do slow clothing workshops, and some are just for beginners. Sometimes, it's not really a place to learn to sew, because it's a bit more complex. Like if we're using sewing machines, it's great if people have got the basics of knowing what's going to happen, and how to go around corners and how to make things fit. That's often what you're doing in upcycling. But I just think it's a bit like cooking is probably easier to learn. And I think that's why often the clothing is sort of left out, because it's a little more complicated. It's not easy, but I think there's heaps of YouTube tutorials and that sort of thing as well, which are quite useful to watch. And I think it is that just starting, it's just have a go, and be prepared to have to unpick sometimes.
Yeah, unpicker is my favourite tool.
Yes. I'll try not, but sometimes you've just got to know it will be much better if I unpick that. And it's also knowing when you're heading off track, how you sometimes think, I'll just keep going, it'll fix itself, and it never does, so you're better off just
I just have this memory embedded in my brain of like when I was first down at the seamstress's studio, and we had this pattern, and I thought, okay, the first thing I'll do, I'll make myself a pair of trappy dacks. And so I got them, I had them all down, and I ended up with like 2 tunnels. I was like, no way I could get in it. Unpick, yeah, I have to read. And it's just that 3D spatial awareness. And once you do it a few times, like you say, you kind of get into it. But
you have to invest time, don't you?
Yeah.
I think that's the thing.
And if you have children, and if you can sew and you have children, to sit with them, or grandchildren, to sit with them and sew around. It's like you saw your mother and grandmother doing that. I saw my mother doing that, and so it was just a normal, natural thing. And whether I was actually doing it next to her, I was still noticing. It was kind of, I was absorbing it somehow.
Yes, it's that can't be what you can't see. So when you see it, you realise it's possible. I remember when in the early days when I was starting doing this work, a young person said to me, "Oh, you mean you can make clothes? You mean you can make them?" And I think this girl just didn't sort of realise. But it's not just women who sew. That was the point that I was making. I think men do as well. And I know my eldest son is the one that does the sewing, and he's got a couple of little children now, and he's often the one that will use the machine and do things. And also with my daughter Lily, when she was going to the music festivals like Splendor and that, she wanted some crocheted shorts. So we sat down and made them together, and, she got the pattern. So I think it's beholden on us with the skills to be trying to pass them on. And help people understand what's possible.
And why that bigger picture. I think that's something that really, about your work is it's about learning these skills, but there's a really deep reason why you're doing it, because actually shifting the way we think about clothing shifts the way that we think about everything that's around us, because it's that relational thing. It's a philosophy, isn't it? And once you start with one thing, it's like when you think about the philosophy of gardening, it infiltrates into how then you eat and how then you relate with the local farm or the soil or the natural areas around you. It's a similar sort of thing. It begins in one spot where you're passionate and then just kind of ripples through your life. So there's two questions I wanted to ask you. One was about you've just finished a permaculture design course down at Northey Street City Farm, and how do you then maybe describe slow clothing through a permaculture lens? Has it shifted how you see things at all? And then the second, where we go after that, I was wondering if we could talk a bit more about some of the stories that you've heard from the people that you've been talking with in your Churchill Fellowship. So we just start with the permaculture lens first.
Permaculture. Through my work in rural reporting, I've been aware of permaculture for a long time. And I did a story with the Sunday Mail with Robin Clayfield, who's up near where you are, when she had her book, Have Your Permaculture and Eat It Too, I think it is. So I'd always been aware of permaculture. And I think the thing about doing the design course, it just fully made me realise that what I'm doing, I could have called it permaculture clothes, really it's all about that, because it's natural, it's regenerative, it's resilient when you're using what you've got to hand and all that kind of thing. So
earth care, people care, fair care, it's all the ethics embedded within it so beautifully.
It's very much about ethics. It's where I've come to and realising. So it was actually really affirming to do the permaculture course, and I just loved the holistic nature of it. It just brings everything into perspective. And I do feel, because I do feel that there's more place for conversations about clothing within permaculture, because it was kind of like the missing narrative. And that's why I guess I spoke up, because I felt the fashion narrative wasn't addressing these ethical concerns. And then I feel there's a little bit of potential for permaculture to have a conversation about clothes as well. So, and that really is the slow clothing conversation.
So within the zone zero, I think, like what's going on inside the house, I think if we kind of bring it into that and sort of use that as the platform. But I also like to connect it in with the zone one, the kitchen garden, the compost area, like thinking about how
definitely.
And then also, further out too with the community, like you were saying, linking it with how you support your local economy, how you're supporting the local shops, the local makers, all of that kind of thing, and thinking about the impacts of the dyes. So thinking about, are we impacting the natural area, the wilderness zone, the zone 5? Are we, all of these things.
And growing your own dye.
Yeah, like
because I've got some Indigofera australis growing. It's kind of it's having a bit of a battle. I think it'll be a long time before I get enough vegetative matter to
even the vegetables, like collecting your avocado pips,
onion skins, avocado pips,
turmeric, all those things. Your vegetable garden can be your clothes dye. Actually finding though the natural undyed fabric that you can actually use is sometimes the challenge. Like actually sourcing that the raw material. Would be a wonderful thing to make more accessible.
There is Full Circle Fibres is an Australian cotton that's grown on a farm out at St George. One part of the process does have to go offshore to Manchester to be spun and come back here. But all we need is investment in Australia and we can have it fully local. And I do believe that will come in time.
So what you're saying, we're growing it? We're growing it. Yeah. The only thing we can't do is spin it.
Spin, yeah. And but I think that will change. I did hear someone from the cotton industry speaking, and he said it wasn't no longer the cost of labour that was an issue. It's actually the cost of electricity in Australia that's stopping it happening here. So, I think it's only a matter of time and requests. Like, people need to be asking for Australian fibre, and we mainly only grow the cotton, alpaca wool as well, and there's potential for local wool spinning to happen here, so we keep all that on shore as well. There's obviously, the COVID year was such a year of disruption. I think it really raised our awareness of lots of different things, and the supply chain, where our clothing and resources come from, was a big awareness. But personally, I had my Churchill Fellowship travel all ready to rock and roll. I was going to the Northern Hemisphere, visiting five, the US, the UK, Japan, and that. It's just deferred for now, but I was going to be looking at how hands-on upcycling can reduce textile waste and enhance well-being. So I continued. I did a virtual Churchill where I started, doing interviews with these people that I was going to be meeting face to face. And I've still got more of that to do, but it's really not quite the same as meeting face to face. So I think what I've done is sort of evolve and adapt the work, and I'm broadening it out too. I guess that's the benefit of doing the permaculture course, because I realised, this is about skills for living. It's simple living. It's knowing, we're so marketed to, and so many things are designed for us now that we can go out and buy anything our little heart desires, but that's not actually very personally satisfying. And I think when you get to a certain stage in life, you realise that. And I think I've got a duty of care to try and educate people around what are the simple things, what are the important things to be doing in life. And so I'm working with a colleague who did the illustrations in Slow Clothing, and we're putting together another book, which, at the moment it's got the working title of Simple Living Skills. And it'll be a little bit along that, because home economics per se has sort of disappeared from the curriculum in some ways. It's evolved into other things. And I guess it's just those things our mothers taught us and fathers taught us, because my dad was great with gardening, and he actually cooked a lot of the meals for us growing up at home. So he was very active as well. But I just think it's what matters in life, and we need a few different narratives going on about living simply, living locally, and how actually doing that benefits your well-being, because when you're focused on living directly, that's what it's called, living directly, instead of living through social media and through other people's eyes and what they think is important. I think living directly, using your hands to do things and having your own energy invested, it makes you value things. So that's where I'm going, Morag. I mean, that's really my journey for next year, is to kind of, and it is about permaculture, but, there's different ways of communicating it. And I just think, there's the things that grandma might have taught you. And there is such I think there's granny skills is a known thing. I think there's someone in South Australia who's coined that term. So,
but even not granny skills, it's even just mama skills. I'm thinking about my age group. So yes. I'm not a grandmother yet, and I was talking to my daughter last night as we were coming home, and she was saying, you should really write a book or something about what life was like when you were growing up, because you always tell people that, when you were young, that was the last point that Australia lived a one planet way of life. And what was that life like? What did we do? And I think it's that's the kind of
about local. It was local, and it was DIY, and it was the resourcefulness of, saving the water, taking it out in the water and your pot plants with it, and, or just all those little simple things. And like it amazes me that often it's the simplest is the best. And I feel as if we're coming full circle on this. And, we've had the razzle dazzle life, and some people, everyone comes to as a different stage of awareness. But I kind of feel as if I've arrived here realizing that a simple, authentic life is the most relaxed. Like mental health is such a big issue now, but when you just concentrate on simple things that you can manage for yourself and being creative, it keeps your brain active and alive as well, which there's links to longevity there and deferring.
With the COVID world, when we are also a lot more local and forced to be more home based, that it gives us something really tangible and practical to learn and to lean into. I think regaining these skills. So gosh, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. And I look forward to your new book. I love slow clothing. I'm going to put all the links below. Is there anywhere in particular that you want me to send people to find out information about your work? Do you have a website that has all those interviews that you've been doing, your virtual Churchill?
Yes, so that's textilebeat.com. And the book is often available in libraries. So, I sell it through my website, but I know there's 20 copies in Brisbane Library. And, that's where I liked as the first port of call. I think just borrow it and just have a read. But I just think it's people putting up their antenna, and they will notice a lot all around them about other things when you change your mindset to simple living. So
and invite other people to come in and do it with you, I think.
Yes, you need to have fellow travellers, because it's so easy to be distracted by all the bright and shiny things, isn't it? You need to find the authentic people who are living in the real world and also living simply. Fight for Planet A. I don't know whether you saw that on the ABC, but Craig Rucastle, following War on Waste, and we've got lived experience of climate change now, and, people are dying from it. And I think that the heat is starting off again this year. So we've really got to change our ways. And I think it's just starting with the small things, just making small changes. That's really what I'd recommend. And there's no script. We make up our own script. So I just think start looking and start listening, and just start by wasting less. That's a really, really good entry to living simply. So thanks, Morag.
Thank you, Jane. Have a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to catching up with you again next year.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Bye.
Trip.
So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to my YouTube channel, the link's below, and then you'll be able to watch this conversation, but also make sure that you subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all new films that come out, and also the release of the extended tour of Lammas Eco Village, where we go into the landscape and the common spaces too. And also you'll get notified of all the new interviews and conversations that come out. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.